As the sun set over our backyard, the air was thick with tension. Lisa froze mid-laugh when Brian and Karen walked through the gate. Her forced smile couldn't hide the panic in her eyes, as Karen, completely unaware of the betrayal, greeted her warmly. I stood there, watching the woman I once trusted crumble under the weight of her own lies, while her lover avoided her gaze. Little did they know, this wasn't just a party. It was the beginning of the reckoning they'd never see coming. Before we dive into the full story, let me know where you're watching this from in the comments below. And if you enjoy stories like this, don't forget to subscribe and hit the notification bell so you never miss the next one. The sound of Lisa's laughter drifted from the living room, soft and melodic, but somehow dissonant in its context. As he sipped his beer, the protagonist glanced over his shoulder. She was curled up on the couch, her phone cradled in both hands, the screen's glow lighting up her face. Her giggles came in quiet bursts, accompanied by the occasional tap of her fingers against the screen. It wasn't the first time he'd seen her engrossed in her phone, but something about this moment felt different. Her smile, once a source of warmth, seemed layered with a secrecy he couldn't place. She hadn't even acknowledged his entrance, a small deviation from their usual routine. Normally, she'd glance up, offer a teasing comment about his post-lawnmower beer, or ask if he needed anything. Today, her focus was elsewhere, her laughter carrying an intimacy that didn't include him. He brushed it off at first, chalking it up to her outgoing nature. Lisa had always been friendly, her energy drawing people in. But as the days passed, her behavior shifted. She began guarding her phone like a treasure, slipping it into her pocket when he entered the room. Late-night text notifications buzzed softly in the dark, a sound that seemed louder with each passing night. She started working late, her explanations rehearsed yet vague. The protagonist tried to shake the unease gnawing at his thoughts, convincing himself he was overreacting. But the gap between them widened. Shared conversations felt stilted, filled with small talk and void of substance. Her once affectionate gestures grew infrequent, replaced by an unspoken distance that hung heavy in the air. He wanted to trust her. After all, trust had been the foundation of their marriage, but doubt had planted its roots, and every glance at her glowing screen felt like a silent accusation he couldn't ignore. In the weeks that followed, Lisa's behavior shifted in ways the protagonist couldn't ignore. At first, it was small changes, subtle enough to explain away. She started keeping her phone close, slipping it into her pocket or turning it face down whenever he walked into the room. The once-entered habit of casually leaving their phones on the kitchen counter while they cooked dinner or watched TV together had vanished. Now her phone seemed almost an extension of her hand, a barrier between them. Then came the late nights. Lisa explained them as necessary sacrifices for a big project her company had recently taken on. "Deadlines are brutal," she said with a wary smile one evening, tossing her bag onto the couch and heading straight to the shower. At first, he believed her. She was ambitious and had always taken pride in her work. But the late nights became frequent, her excuses too polished, her tone slightly defensive, whenever he asked about the details. The texts were harder to dismiss. The soft vibration of her phone woke him more than once in the middle of the night. He'd glance over to see her illuminated by the screen, her face a mix of concentration and amusement. "Just checking emails," she whispered one night when she caught him stirring, quickly locking the device and turning her back to him. Emails didn't typically make people smile like that. More inconsistencies began to surface. Lisa, who used to eagerly share funny anecdotes or gossip from work, now avoided talking about her day. When he pressed her for details about the project that was consuming her time, she deflected with vague answers. Once he asked her who she'd been texting so much lately, and she laughed it off. "Just some colleagues," she said. But her voice lacked its usual ease. The knot in his stomach tightened with each passing day. One evening, while she was in the shower, he noticed her phone buzzing on the counter. The name Brian flashed briefly before the notification disappeared. He'd never heard her mention a Brian before. When he asked casually about her coworkers that evening, She rattled off a list of familiar names, but didn't include Brian. His suspicion deepened. Other details nagged at him. Her perfume seemed stronger some nights when she came home late, and once he found a receipt for a restaurant they hadn't been to in years tucked into her purse. Still, he clung to the hope that he was imagining things, that he was reading too much into her behavior. But deep down, he knew something was wrong. The trust that had once been the bedrock of their marriage now felt fragile, like a thin layer of ice cracking under his feet. The unease settled deep in his chest, a constant pressure that refused to fade. The protagonist tried to convince himself he was being irrational, that the changes in Lisa's behavior could be explained. After all, relationships went through ebbs and flows. Stress from work could make anyone distant. But as the days passed, the knot in his stomach tightened, and with it, a torrent of conflicting emotions he struggled to suppress. He replayed the moments over and over in his mind. The late-night texts, the mysterious Brian, the way Lisa's smile seemed brighter when she glanced at her phone than when she looked at him. Had he become paranoid? Was he reading too much into harmless coincidences? He wanted to believe that, but the small nagging signs whispered otherwise. Sitting in the living room one evening, he watched her from across the room. Lisa was perched on the couch, her legs tucked under her, scrolling on her phone. Her laughter, soft and melodic, should have been comforting, but instead it felt like an invitation to doubt. He noticed the way she angled the screen slightly away, a small, unconscious gesture that made his throat tighten. He tore his gaze away, pretending to focus on the muted TV. His hand toyed with the edge of his beer bottle, the condensation slick against his fingers. Maybe he was being unfair, projecting insecurities onto her. Their marriage had been strong for years, filled with shared jokes, late-night conversations, and dreams of the future. Wasn't that enough to trust her now? But trust, he realized bitterly, wasn't unconditional. It needed to be nurtured. And lately, her actions felt more like weeds choking the foundation they'd built. He tried to dismiss the thoughts, shaking his head as if the motion could physically dislodge the suspicions. Yet, as he lay awake that night, staring at the ceiling, the doubts crept back in. He couldn't ignore the weight of her absence during their shared moments. She used to light up when talking about her day. Now, her stories were sparse, her answers curt. When he reached for her in bed, her touch felt hesitant, as if her mind was elsewhere. His chest ached with the growing distance between them, but voicing his concerns felt impossible. What if he was wrong? What if confronting her shattered the fragile balance they still had? Some nights he found himself pacing the kitchen, staring at the glow of the digital clock on the microwave. The house was quiet, the kind of silence that magnified the chaos in his mind. He'd gripped the edge of the counter, breathing deeply, willing himself to push the doubts aside. But no matter how hard he tried, they always returned, gnawing at the edges of his resolve. Was he imagining things, or was the truth far worse than he dared to admit? The house was unusually quiet that afternoon, the faint rush of water from the upstairs shower the only sound. The protagonist stood in the kitchen, his gaze falling on Lisa's phone charging on the counter. It was rare for her to leave it unattended these days, and the sight of it stirred something primal, a mix of dread and compulsion he couldn't ignore. His hands trembled slightly as he reached for the device, his rational mind warring with the gnawing ache in his gut. "This is wrong," he whispered under his breath, but the words lacked conviction. The thought of invading her privacy felt like crossing a line, yet the weight of his suspicions pressed him forward. Her passcode hadn't changed. The familiar sequence of numbers unlocked the screen, a detail that made his stomach twist. Her first mistake. His fingers hovered over the messaging app, his breath catching as he opened it. There, at the top of the list, was a name he didn't recognize. Brian. He hesitated, a part of him hoping it was a misunderstanding. But as he tapped on the thread, his world shattered. The messages were unmistakable, flirty, playful, peppered with inside jokes that made his chest tighten. One stood out among the rest. A text from Brian that read, "Last night was incredible. Can't stop thinking about you." His vision blurred as he stared at the screen, the words searing into his mind like a brand. He scrolled further, his hands trembling uncontrollably. The timestamps aligned perfectly with the nights Lisa had claimed to be working late. Then there were the pictures. Selfies of the two of them, laughing together in what appeared to be a hotel room. The ease and intimacy in their expressions gutted him. The phone slipped from his hand onto the counter with a dull thud. His chest felt tight, his breathing shallow as a cold wave of realization crashed over him. This wasn't paranoia. This wasn't a mistake. It was betrayal, plain and undeniable. He gripped the edge of the counter, his knuckles white, as a storm of emotions surged through him. Anger, heartbreak, disbelief, all mingled with a suffocating sense of foolishness. How had he missed the signs? How long had this been going on under his nose? Upstairs, the sound of the shower stopped. He hastily set the phone back down, forcing himself to appear composed. Though inside, he was anything but. He needed time to think. The confrontation would come, but not yet. Not like this. The messages replayed in his mind like a broken record, each word cutting deeper than the last. The initial wave of heartbreak hit him like a freight train, raw and overwhelming. The one he had trusted for over a decade, the one he had shared his life with, had betrayed him. His chest felt heavy, as though the air had been sucked out of the room. He sat at the kitchen table, gripping its edges, his knuckles white, his jaw clenched tight as he tried to steady his breathing, but his thoughts swirled in chaos. Anger surged next, hot and unrelenting. It wasn't just the betrayal. It was the audacity. She hadn't even tried to hide it well. Her careless abandon, the selfies with Brian, the late-night texts, all felt like a slap in the face. He wanted to storm upstairs, fling the bathroom door open and confront her right then and there. His fists curled at the thought, but he froze. What would that achieve? She would deny it, twist the narrative, and turn his justified anger into a weapon against him. He knew her well enough to predict that. Instead, he forced himself to breathe deeply, exhaling slowly through his nose. The hurt and anger boiled beneath the surface, but he realized he needed clarity. Rushing into a confrontation now would give her the upper hand. He wasn't just a victim of her deceit. He would not allow her to make him a fool in his own home. His mind shifted from the chaos of emotion to cold calculation. The betrayal wasn't going anywhere. It was etched in his memory. But now, it was time to think strategically. He needed to know everything, how long it had been going on, how deep it ran, and who else might be involved. If he was going to confront her, it would be on his terms, not hers. He would have the truth in his corner, undeniable and absolute. He rose from the table, his movements deliberate as he placed the phone exactly where she had left it. His expression hardened, the raw emotion replaced by steely resolve. Upstairs, the water stopped, signaling her return. He walked to the living room, forcing himself to sit calmly, though his mind was already plotting his next steps. Lisa's betrayal had shaken him, but it wouldn't break him. He would make sure of that. The next morning, while Lisa still slept upstairs, the protagonist sat at the dining table, his laptop open and his mind racing. The quiet hum of the refrigerator was the only sound in the house. He took a sip of his coffee, its bitterness mirroring the knot in his stomach. He needed answers, and he was determined to find them. Starting with her messages, he combed through every detail. The name Brian offered a small clue, and with each search, he pieced together fragments of his identity. A few minutes on Lisa's social media revealed a tagged photo from her company's holiday party last year. There he was, Brian, standing in the background, smiling next to a woman with her arm around him. His heart sank. Clicking on Brian's profile revealed more than the protagonist was prepared for. Pictures of Brian with his wife Karen and 2 young children filled the screen. Family hikes, soccer games, and birthday parties. Their lives looked perfect, idyllic even. The contrast between the happy family man portrayed online and the man who had stolen away moments with Lisa hit him like a punch to the gut. A new layer of betrayal settled in his chest. This wasn't just about his wife's infidelity. It was about the destruction it could wreak on an innocent family. He scrolled through Karen's posts, her pride in their family shining through every caption. "Brian's the best dad," she'd written under a photo of him coaching their son's soccer game. His fingers hovered over her profile picture for a moment, guilt creeping in. But the guilt was quickly replaced by a cold resolve. She deserved to know. She deserved the truth just as much as he did. He leaned back in his chair, staring blankly at the screen. The discovery of Brian's wife and children deepened his determination. This wasn't just an affair between two reckless individuals. It was a betrayal that stretched beyond his own marriage, touching lives that didn't deserve the fallout. His gaze hardened as he closed the laptop. He couldn't act rashly. If he involved Karen, it had to be deliberate, calculated, and on his terms. This wasn't just about confronting Lisa anymore. It was about exposing the truth and ensuring neither Lisa nor Brian could evade the consequences of their actions. He wouldn't be the only one blindsided by their lies. The idea came to him late at night as he stared at the ceiling, the quiet of the house pressing down on him like a weight. Confronting Lisa directly would be futile. She'd deny, deflect, and twist the narrative. No, he needed a plan that left no room for escape. A moment where the truth would be undeniable. The more he thought about Karen and Brian, the more the pieces clicked into place. Karen deserved to know, and if this betrayal was going to unravel, it would do so on his terms. The next morning, he began drafting a casual message to Karen. It needed to be perfect. Not overly formal, but friendly enough to seem innocent. He introduced himself as Lisa's husband and mentioned they were hosting a casual backyard gathering for neighbors and friends. He highlighted that it would be a great chance to meet new people and mentioned they had mutual acquaintances through Lisa's workplace. After rereading the message several times, he hit send, his heartbeat quickening. Karen's reply came sooner than expected. Polite, enthusiastic, and unsuspecting. She confirmed their attendance, mentioning how nice it would be to meet everyone. He felt a pang of guilt reading her words. She was oblivious to the storm brewing beneath the surface, but that only strengthened his resolve. The stage was set. Now, he needed to make sure everything about the gathering appeared normal. Lisa's late-night texting hadn't stopped, and her secrecy had only increased. She asked once who was invited, her tone cautious but casual. "A mix of neighbors and a few people from work," he replied evenly, omitting any mention of Brian and Karen. Her relief was palpable, and he had to suppress the satisfaction that flickered within him. The hardest part was navigating the growing tension in their interactions. Lisa's late-night texting hadn't stopped, and her secrecy had only increased. She asked once who was invited, her tone cautious but casual. "A mix of neighbors and a few people from work," he replied evenly, omitting any mention of Brian and Karen. Her relief was palpable, and he had to suppress the satisfaction that flickered within him. Every detail of the gathering was calculated to lull Lisa into complacency while setting the stage for her exposure. As the day approached, the tension in the house became a silent, unspoken force. She thought she had the upper hand, that her secrets were safe. But he knew better. And soon, so would everyone else. The days leading up to the backyard gathering were a whirlwind of preparation. The protagonist poured himself into every detail, ensuring the event looked as casual and welcoming as possible. The lawn was freshly mowed, string lights were hung across the yard, and tables were arranged with simple yet inviting centerpieces, small mason jars filled with wildflowers. On the surface, it appeared to be a typical suburban barbecue, but beneath it lay a carefully constructed plan. Lisa was surprisingly enthusiastic, offering ideas and helping with the arrangements. She stood in the kitchen one afternoon, meticulously slicing lemons for a pitcher of iced tea, humming to herself as if the weight of her deception didn't exist. Her enthusiasm grated on him, but he forced himself to smile, nodding along to her suggestions about recipes and table placements. "I think we should use the red napkins," she said, holding them up. "They'll pop against the white plates." "Good idea," he replied, keeping his tone even. Inside, the irony of her involvement in orchestrating her own downfall twisted his emotions further. Every cheerful suggestion, every carefree laugh as she tied balloons to the patio rail felt like salt in a wound. He double-checked the guest list, confirming Brian and Karen's attendance. The thought of their arrival filled him with a mix of dread and anticipation. This wasn't just about revenge. It was about reclaiming control of his life and confronting the truth head-on. By the evening before the gathering, everything was ready. The yard looked picture-perfect, and Lisa, satisfied with their work, stretched out on the couch with a glass of wine. She smiled at him, oblivious to the storm brewing beneath his calm exterior. "This is going to be great," she said. He nodded, keeping his true thoughts to himself. Tomorrow, everything would change. The backyard buzzed with the hum of conversation and the sizzle of burgers on the grill. Neighbors laughed and mingled, their voices blending with the soft music playing from a speaker. The protagonist moved between groups, handing out drinks and making small talk, all the while keeping an eye on Lisa. She was in her element, laughing with friends and fussing over the food, her nervous energy masked by practiced ease. But he could see the tension in her gestures, the way she smoothed her dress too often, the quick glances toward the gate as if expecting something. Then they arrived. Brian and Karen walked through the gate, hand in hand, their smiles polite but slightly reserved. Karen, dressed in a breezy sundress, looked around with genuine curiosity, complimenting the setup. Brian's posture was more rigid, his eyes darting quickly over the crowd before landing on Lisa. For a fleeting moment, Lisa froze. Her drink hovered mid-air, and her laughter faltered. But just as quickly, she recovered, plastering on a bright smile and raising a hand in a casual wave. The protagonist stepped forward, his voice steady. "Brian, Karen, glad you could make it. Let me show you around." "Thanks for inviting us," Karen said warmly. "This looks amazing." Lisa approached cautiously, her movements stiff despite her forced grin. "Hi, Karen," she said, her voice slightly higher pitched than usual. "So nice to see you again." Karen beamed, oblivious to the undercurrent of tension. "You too. This is such a great idea. We've been meaning to meet more people around here." Brian muttered a polite greeting, avoiding Lisa's gaze as he clung to Karen's side. Lisa, meanwhile, fidgeted with the hem of her dress, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. The protagonist watched it all unfold with cold determination. The game had begun, and the players were all in place. The backyard hummed with conversation and laughter, but the protagonist focused on one goal, drawing Karen closer while keeping Lisa and Brian on edge. He approached Karen as she admired the string lights overhead, her smile warm and genuine. "This is such a lovely setup," Karen said, turning to him. "You must have put a lot of thought into it." "Thank you," he replied with a casual smile. "Lisa helped a lot with the details. She's great at making everything look perfect." His gaze flicked briefly to Lisa, who stood a few feet away, pretending to be engrossed in a conversation with a neighbor. Her shoulders stiffened. Karen beamed. "It shows. I've been meaning to ask, how long have you and Lisa been in this neighborhood?" "About 8 years," he said, leaning slightly toward her. "And you? I noticed Brian's been at the company for a while. Must be tough juggling work and family." Karen's face lit up at the mention of her family. "Oh, it can be. But Brian's great with the kids. He always makes time for soccer games and bedtime stories, even with his crazy work schedule." The protagonist nodded thoughtfully. "That's impressive. Lisa's mentioned how demanding things have been at work lately. She's had quite a few late nights with Brian, hasn't she?" The comment hung in the air for a moment, subtle enough to seem innocuous, but sharp enough to draw a reaction. Karen tilted her head slightly, her smile faltering. "Late nights?" she echoed, her tone light but curious. "Oh, just work stuff, I'm sure," he said quickly, waving it off. "They've been tackling some big projects from what Lisa's told me." Mary shook her head. Across the yard, Lisa's laugh rang out, but it sounded forced. She caught his eye briefly before turning back to her group, her grip on her drink noticeably tighter. Brian, standing awkwardly by the grill, shifted uncomfortably. Karen, oblivious to the tension, nodded. Yes, Brian's been swamped too, but they've got a good team, right? Absolutely, the protagonist said, his voice smooth. It's nice to see them so close. Like a little work family. Karen smiled again, but her brows furrowed slightly as she glanced at Brian. He avoided her gaze, pretending to focus on the sizzling burgers. Lisa's movements grew more jerky, her usual confidence faltering as she fidgeted with her hair and adjusted the napkins on a nearby table. The protagonist suppressed a grim smile. The tension between Lisa and Brian was palpable, their discomfort growing with every carefully placed comment. The storm was building, and he was ready to let it break. The evening settled into a calm rhythm, but the protagonist felt anything but calm. The soft glow of the string lights and the chatter of guests created a deceivingly warm atmosphere. Yet, beneath it all, tension crackled like a live wire. He knew the moment was near. Standing near the center of the yard, he clinked his glass gently with a fork, the metallic ring cutting through the noise. Conversations paused, and all eyes turned toward him. Thank you everyone for coming tonight, he began, his voice steady, but carrying a weight that commanded attention. It's not often we get to come together like this, and I wanted to take a moment to express how grateful I am to have such wonderful friends and neighbors. He scanned the crowd, his gaze brushing briefly over Lisa, who stood near the table, her smile faltering. Brian, beside Karen, shifted his weight nervously, gripping his drink. The protagonist inhaled deeply, letting a moment of silence hang before continuing. There's something about gatherings like this that reminds us of the things that matter most: honesty, trust, and the connections we share with the people we care about. His voice tightened slightly, and he saw Lisa stiffen, her knuckles white as she clutched her glass. But sometimes, he continued, his tone sharpening, we discover that trust isn't as strong as we thought, that the people we hold closest can betray us in ways we never imagined. A murmur rippled through the crowd, and Lisa's smile disappeared entirely. Her eyes darted to him, wide with panic. James, she began, her voice thin and strained, but he raised a hand to silence her. Let me finish, Lisa, he said, his voice cold and firm. He turned to the group, his heart pounding but his resolve unshaken. For the past several months, I'd been living a lie without even knowing it. I believed my wife was working late, dedicating herself to her career. I believed her when she said she was texting colleagues late at night. But what I didn't realize was that those late nights and texts weren't about work at all. The yard fell into stunned silence. Karen's brow furrowed, her gaze flickering between him and Brian, who looked as if he wished the ground would swallow him whole. Lisa, he said, locking eyes with her, do you want to explain to everyone here about your relationship with Brian, or shall I? Lisa froze, her face pale as she struggled to find words. I don't know what you're talking about, she stammered, her voice barely above a whisper. He gave a bitter laugh, shaking his head. Don't insult everyone's intelligence. I've seen the texts, the photos. I know about the hotels, the late-night meetings. He turned to Brian, his voice growing colder. And you, Brian, what do you have to say for yourself? Or are you going to let Karen hear it from me? Karen gasped audibly, her hand flying to her mouth as she turned to Brian. What is he talking about? She demanded, her voice trembling. Brian, tell me he's lying. Brian opened his mouth, but no words came out. He looked away, shame etched across his face. It's true, the protagonist said, his voice steady but filled with anger. Your husband and my wife have been having an affair for months. Gilder. Karen staggered back as if she'd been struck, her eyes filling with tears. The crowd erupted into murmurs, and Lisa's glass slipped from her hand, shattering on the patio. James, please, Lisa whispered, stepping toward him, her voice shaking. We can talk about this privately. No, he cut her off, his voice firm. You don't get to hide anymore. You betrayed me, you lied to me, and now everyone knows exactly who you are. Erin turned to Brian, her voice rising. How could you? after everything we've built, after our kids, you threw it all away for this? The yard was heavy with the weight of shattered trust. The protagonist stood tall, his heart pounding but his mind clear. Lisa and Brian had made their choices, and now they had to face the consequences. There was no turning back. Lisa's face went pale, her lips trembling as she stepped forward, hands raised defensively. "James, this isn't fair," she stammered, her voice cracking. "You've got it all wrong. It's not what it looks like. Please, let me explain." "Explain what, Lisa?" the protagonist cut in, his tone icy. "Explain the texts, the photos, the hotel rooms? What part of that isn't what it looks like?" Lisa's mouth opened and closed, searching for words that wouldn't come. Her gaze darted desperately around the yard, as though seeking an ally among the stunned faces. But all she found were whispers and judgment. Karen, meanwhile, stood frozen, her eyes wide with shock. Slowly, she turned to Brian, her voice trembling as she asked, "Brian, is this true?" Example after example, Brian argued the point. Brian, caught in the crossfire, shifted uncomfortably. His eyes darted from Karen to Lisa, then to the ground, his body tense. "Karen, Look, it's not what you think," he mumbled, his voice barely audible. "I didn't mean for—" "Not what I think," Karen snapped, her tone sharp and cutting as she took a step toward him. "Don't you dare. After what he just said? After this?" She gestured wildly toward the gathering, her hands shaking. "Tell me the truth, Brian. Were you cheating on me? With her?" Brian hesitated, his silence louder than any confession. Lisa's breath hitched audibly, and she turned toward Karen. "Karen, I never meant to—" "Don't," Karen cut her off, her voice rising. "Don't you dare speak to me. You smiled in my face, acted like you cared, while this was happening behind my back." The weight of the truth pressed down on Lisa and Brian, their guilt palpable. Their words, their excuses, were no match for the anger and betrayal radiating from Karen and the cold resolve of the protagonist. Their lies had unraveled, leaving them exposed and powerless under the harsh light of reality. The yard was plunged into an uneasy silence, broken only by the soft clinking of glasses and hushed murmurs among the guests. Eyes darted between Lisa and Brian, their shame etched clearly across their faces, and Karen, whose anger and heartbreak radiated in equal measure. No one quite knew what to say or do, but the weight of the revelation hung heavy in the air. A neighbor near the grill leaned over to his wife, whispering, "Did you know anything about this?" She shook her head, her expression a mix of disbelief and discomfort. Another couple stood awkwardly by the drink table, their glances filled with quiet judgment. "I can't believe this," someone muttered under their breath, audible enough to catch Lisa's attention. She flinched, her hands gripping the back of a chair, as if to steady herself. So, one by one, the guests began to gather their things. A woman offered the protagonist an awkward pat on the shoulder as she passed, her attempt at sympathy falling flat. "We should go," someone said, their voice low but firm, and others nodded in agreement. As they filed out, the mood was somber. Disappointment and shock etched onto every face. The once cheerful atmosphere had soured completely, leaving Lisa and Brian standing alone in the wreckage of their exposed betrayal. The house was eerily silent after the last guest had left. The backyard, once glowing with laughter and light, now felt empty, littered with discarded plates and half-filled glasses. The protagonist sat alone in the living room, staring blankly at the darkened window. The confrontation had gone exactly as he'd planned. Yet, the rush of vindication he'd anticipated was muted. Instead, a deep, aching emptiness settled in its place. He leaned back in his chair, running a hand over his face. The truth was out. Lisa and Brian had been exposed, but the victory felt hollow. He thought back to the look on Lisa's face, her panicked denials and desperate pleas. There had been a time when he would have rushed to comfort her, to bridge the distance between them. That time was gone. lost under the weight of her betrayal. Lisa sat at the edge of the kitchen table, her face streaked with tears. "James," she began softly, her voice shaking. "Please, let's talk about this. We can fix it. I'll do whatever it takes." He shook his head, his voice steady but cold. "Lisa, this isn't something you can fix. You didn't just betray me. You destroyed the foundation of what we had. Trust, honesty. They're gone." Her sobs grew louder, but he didn't move to console her. Instead, he stared at the framed photo on the mantel, a smiling snapshot of their once happy life. He felt like he was looking at strangers, two people who no longer existed. For the first time in months, there was clarity. The marriage couldn't be salvaged. Her betrayal had fractured something irreparable. He wasn't just letting go of Lisa, he was letting go of the life he thought they had. And with that realization came a strange sense of peace, tinged with the quiet sadness of an ending. In the days following the confrontation, the cracks in Lisa's carefully constructed life widened into chasms she could no longer bridge. The once welcoming smiles of neighbors turned into cold glances and hushed whispers. The community, once her safe haven, now saw her as a pariah. Trips to the grocery store became exercises in avoidance, her head bowed under the weight of judgmental stares. She moved out of the house 2 weeks later, packing her belongings in silence, while the protagonist stood by, offering no words of comfort. The home, once filled with shared laughter and memories, now felt hollow, a shell of what it used to be. As she carried the last box to her car, she paused, looking back at him. "I'm sorry," she whispered, her voice cracking. He didn't respond, only nodding curtly before turning back inside. Meanwhile, Brian's life unraveled with equal intensity. Karen wasted no time filing for divorce, her fury matched only by her heartbreak. She shielded their children from the details, but the tension in their home was palpable. Brian's colleagues began to keep their distance, and whispers about his indiscretions spread through the office. Both Lisa and Brian faced the consequences of their choices. Isolated, their lives dismantled piece by piece. What they'd gambled everything for had left them with nothing but regret. In the weeks that followed Lisa's departure, the protagonist found himself alone in the quiet of the house. At first, the silence felt oppressive, a constant reminder of what had been lost. But slowly, he began to reclaim the space, not just the physical house, but his sense of self. He rearranged the furniture, painted the walls a fresh, light color, and cleared away the remnants of their shared life. Each change, however small, felt like a step toward freedom. He threw himself into hobbies he'd long neglected. The guitar that had collected dust in the corner was brought out again, its strings a source of solace during sleepless nights. He began running in the early mornings, the steady rhythm of his feet on the pavement grounding him in the present. He found satisfaction in small victories, learning to cook meals he once relied on Lisa to prepare, fixing the leaky faucet she'd always insisted needed a professional. More importantly, he started to reflect. The betrayal, though devastating, had forced him to confront truths he had ignored for too long. The complacency in their marriage, the cracks in communication, and the parts of himself he had let slip away. Through the pain, he discovered resilience. The man who had once doubted his worth now saw his strength. He was no longer defined by what had happened to him, but by how he chose to move forward. Karen's life, once grounded in routine and stability, was thrown into turmoil. But amid the chaos of divorce proceedings and the emotional fallout, she found her anchor in her children. Their soccer practices, school projects, and bedtime stories became her focus, a daily reminder of her purpose. She poured her energy into creating a sense of normalcy for them, even as she rebuilt her own shattered world. Initially, the pain of betrayal felt all-consuming. But slowly, Karen began to reclaim herself. She picked up painting again, a hobby she had abandoned years ago, finding solace in the strokes of color on canvas. Weekend hikes with her kids became her escape, the fresh air and laughter filling the void left by Brian's absence. Occasionally, she and the protagonist would meet for coffee or a walk in the park. Their conversations were honest and unfiltered, a safe space to share their struggles without judgment. "I didn't think I could do this," Karen admitted one afternoon, watching her kids play on the swings. "But it's getting easier. One day at a time." "You're stronger than you realize," he replied, offering a small, genuine smile. In each other, they found a quiet, mutual support, a reminder that healing was possible, even after the deepest wounds. In the quiet months that followed the upheaval, the protagonist discovered something he hadn't expected: peace. The betrayal, though painful, had become a catalyst for transformation. He realized that his self-worth wasn't tied to his past or to the actions of others. The life he had built with Lisa, once the center of his identity, was gone. But in its place, he began to carve out a new sense of purpose. He learned to embrace solitude, finding comfort in his own company. Long walks through the neighborhood became moments of reflection. Journaling helped him process the waves of emotions that still surfaced from time to time. In each entry, he acknowledged the pain, but also celebrated his progress, the rediscovery of his independence, his strength, and his ability to move forward without bitterness. For the first time in years, he felt unburdened, free to envision a future shaped by his own choices. The experience had taught him to trust himself again, to value his resilience, and to recognize that growth often comes from life's darkest moments. The protagonist's journey serves as a powerful reminder of the enduring value of truth and resilience. Betrayal may shatter the foundation of a life, but it also offers an opportunity to rebuild, stronger, wiser, and more self-aware. The pain of being wronged is undeniable, but it does not have to define one's story. Through the trials he faced, he learned that healing is a process, one that requires patience, self-compassion, and the courage to face hard truths. It is in this process that he rediscovered his own strength, proving that even in the face of loss, there is room for growth and renewal. Looking toward the future, the protagonist embraced the idea that endings are also beginnings. His journey wasn't just about overcoming betrayal, it was about reclaiming his life and stepping into a new chapter with hope and confidence. The message is clear: life's hardships may bend us, but they cannot break us, unless we let them. With truth and resilience as our guide, we can emerge from even the deepest wounds with a stronger, brighter vision for what lies ahead.